Hi everyone, this is Mimi Ghez, and you are now watching and listening to Promoting Your Donors' Interest into Organized Philanthropy. Are you doing everything you can? A webinar for donors. Who am I? My name is Mimi Ghez, and I'm president of a philanthropic advising company called Echo Communications, which I founded in 2003. And a few years ago, I got curious about the potential of donor networks for grant makers and founded an initiative called Hidden Opportunities for Grantors and Their Advisors. Let me tell you why I created the initiative. I was hired in 1993, kind of fresh out of graduate school as a 23-year-old into a program role at a nonprofit, which has become sort of a prominent force today in violence prevention in California. It's now doing international work. And I was hired to do their communications program and eventually told that part of my responsibilities would include fund development to cover the program expenses that I was eventually to head director of. And this was quite intimidating to me. It was about $1 million a year, and I had no background. While I was a communications specialist, I had no background in fund development. And there was no training provided. And this is very frequently the case, as many of you know, of course, with nonprofits, that program people are asked to do their own fundraising and find it stressful. So I was not an unusual case in this regard, but it was difficult, and I remembered that. And I didn't know anything about donor networks. We had a fair amount, I would say actually a terrific amount of foundation support from many of the big donors, Hilton, Irvine, Ford, et cetera, supporting our work. But I didn't know to ask the questions about their memberships in donor networks and what it could mean for us as an organization. And after almost a decade, I left the organization and I went to work eventually for George Soros's Open Society Institute, which is now Open Society Foundations, and was given a relatively small grant-making portfolio and charged with sort of figuring out programming that would bring Americans up to speed on ways that they could support multilateral approaches to achieving our foreign policy interests as opposed to unilateral ones. And because the size of the grant making was small and kind of experimental, a large charge of my job was to sit down with peer grant makers and to have conversations about what we could do together. Also very common. How could we create, funding collaboratives, which we eventually did, which created something called the Connect US Fund, which unfortunately has just met its demise, but many, many years later. But which helped us, Open Society, translate a $500,000 initial contribution into eventually more than $10 million because of the contributions of other major foundations that came to the table, in part because of my work. And because of this, I got very involved in donor networks, making presentations and understanding donor culture. Won an award from the Council on Foundations for some of the products that we developed and for a product that we developed and et cetera. And so when I left the foundation, I walked away truly understanding the power of organized philanthropy. And I also saw that it was vastly underutilized. And so when I founded my own philanthropic advising company and developed a set of tools and services that allow donors and their grantees to gain maximum visibility within these kinds of settings to pursue their interests. And what I found are a couple of things. On the donor side, what I've spent the past couple of years doing leadership with senior members of foundations and nonprofits across the country, and have had fascinating conversations with folks across the board. And what I found on the foundation side is that there's a bit of malaise in terms of the what can be done in and with donor networks. When I refer to donor networks, I'm talking principally about affinity groups recognized by the Council on Foundations, which can be found listed on their website, www.cof.org, and also regional donor alliances, such as those that are members of the Forum of Regional Associations of Grantmakers. And that while many foundations are sort of, sending in their membership check, on an annual basis, it could be for $650 or it could be for $16,000, depending on the size and scope of their grant making. That in many cases, what the donor network heads are telling me is that they're receiving the checks, but that they're not always hearing back from the foundation program officers or program directors about active participation in their programming. So maybe folks will come to an annual conference meeting, or they'll submit an idea for a panel, for the annual conference, or maybe for a webinar, but that there's a range of activities that's happening within any one particular donor network that a foundation or a corporate giving program can belong to, that is in general, and I'm speaking in general terms now, of course, that is being underutilized. So, if there are interesting grantees that a foundation, supports, that in addition to the kind of the baseline ways that they can promote them into grantees, into donor networks, there are so many other kinds of ways, and a lot of foundations are sort of doing A through C, but they're not doing the A through Z level, of kind of getting on the phone and talking to the communications directors over at the donor networks and saying, here's what we have, where can it land? Can we promote our interests into audio conferences or policy telebriefings or plenary sessions of conferences, et cetera? And in many cases, not all, but in many cases, this is because of capacity issues on the grantmaker side, that there's simply, lots of folks kind of operate with 2 program officers or even less. And some people operate with more, but that their jobs are their plates are full, and that they haven't perceived this to be of adequate value to them to really dedicate a lot of time and energy into, aggressively promoting their grantees into these settings. There's also a kind of malaise, I think, about the value of affinity groups that I've heard about. There seems to be sort of like a little bit of a culture of, we have it on our resume kind of thing, and we do participate on some level, but how much more can we really get out of it? And I'm here to tell you that they're incredible, valuable settings where your grantees can benefit in ways that are just extraordinary, and where your own portfolio can benefit in similar kinds of ways as well. On the grantee side, what I found in the course of these 2 years of research is that there's generally a lack of knowledge about these networks. In some cases, there are groups that do tend to show up on the agenda of things repeatedly, and I heard some frustration about that. Sort of, why isn't there more innovation in terms of who is gaining the podium in my interviews? And I'm also hearing very repeatedly about a fundamental knowledge gap that exists amongst the others. So, for example, Robert Keston, who's executive director of a wonderful organization called, he's the USA executive director of the People's Movement for Human Rights Learning, and he said to me the other day on the phone, I've heard of donor networks, but I do not follow them. I have never met with any of them. I know they exist, but I have no real knowledge of what issues they focus on, or where they are, or who the leaders of them are. So if you see where I'm headed with this, there's a real resource vacuum here, in the sense that someone doing important human rights movement work, there ought to be a resource for him and for others to understand better what his possibilities are for landing as a resource for donors, so that the programming that donors are able to create in the area that he's an expert in is able to be as varied, informed, and thought-provoking as possible, and impactful on the community level as possible. Let's flip here. And I also want to go over here some of the platforms that are available to donors within donor networks. You know, many of them, I'm talking now about, it could be grant makers in health, grant makers for children, youth, and families, grant makers for aging, grant makers, any of the big grant maker organizations recognized by the Council on Foundations have at least one, probably some combination of the platforms listed here in front of you. You'll see, and more. I actually haven't listed them all. So there's audio conferences on select topics that donors such as yourself can key into, annual meetings that bring donors members together, webinars for donors, publications, blogs, and site visits, all of which many times feature grantees of donor members who are doing really thought-provoking, exciting, outstanding work. So the question is, are your grantees showing up on these platforms? Are they showing up again and again and again? And how are they benefiting? Because the ones that end up there are benefiting in significant ways. I'll flip to the next slide. So as you can see, what I want you to walk home with here is that these are precious environments for you and for your grantees. You know this already, I'm sure. You're involved, you're doing something because you're on this call. You're probably a member to at least some of the networks recognized by the two organizations that I mentioned earlier, the Forum and the Council. These are environments that give you your portfolio, even beyond your grantees, if you're doing research or polling or other kind of thinking, your funding strategy, for example. It gives you a place to discuss those with your peer donors, to get their valuable feedback, to find any co-donors that you might be looking for the future, and to find support for your grantees so that when your grant runs out, they're sustainable into the future. They don't necessarily have to come back to you for additional funding. So for both you and for your grantees who end up in speaking roles at these settings, donor networks offer you a chance to educate co-donors about what you're up to and your innovations. They offer you the chance to find new funding sources and co-donors, to educate other donors in the field about your good work, and to hand out your reports and other resources, and on. New relationships for your grantees with other donors who can carry their interests into the future. It gives your grantees the ability to influence the way dollars are spent in their field into the future. Some examples, if you're asking yourself, why does this matter to me? Some examples of foundations that have really made it big in this way. So I'm going to start by talking about the grantees, because ultimately that's where the impact is. So Grant Makers for Children, Youth, and Families has a publication called Making the Link. It is distributed on a periodic basis to the donor members of its community. I think there are probably 300, if I'm not mistaken, in that community. They solicit periodically either foundation thought leaders and grantees to speak, to author a 4-page article about interesting innovations and particular issues of interest to the donor members of the network. So, if you're the foundation that is authoring Making the Link piece about research that your foundation is sponsoring, that's research that then gets into the hands of, not just 1 or 2 donors on a conference call, but to the 300 members of Grant Makers for Children, Youth, and Families. This is, once again, obviously you have to work with the leadership at Grant Makers to persuade them that your issue is of interest to their donors or relevance to their donors. But if and when you do that, and you can do that, you're the one who's speaking to them, and this happens all the time. Similarly, at grant makers in health, they have a series, a sort of a focus series for leaders to write about issues that they're focusing on, policy issues, et cetera, for folks. And Colorado Trust, many folks have authored idea pieces that once again have gone to all of the member donors of the network, and helped to promote their own agenda, of course. Grantees who show up, let's see, there were 3 donors in the Washington Regional Association of Grantmakers over the course of the summer 2012, who got interested in the topic of human trafficking in the D.C. area. This is, of course, the D.C.-based regional association. They invited 2 major players who are D.C.-based to NGOs to speak about it to peer donors over an educational seminar. One day, I was there. It was a wonderful presentation. I was a member at that point of the network, and a wonderful presentation by the 2 leaders. And they were able to lay out their business cards and their annual reports, and their fact sheets and brochures for the donors, despite the non-solicitation environment. Everyone sort of gets to walk away with those materials. And I spoke with Bradley Miles, who's the head of Polaris Project, who was one of the presenters the other day, and he said that his phone was ringing the next day. I think he said it was from donors in attendance wanting to know more, and that he received promptly a $10,000 check, and he hadn't finished all the follow-up calls. So just one example of, as I say, I've spent 2 years doing this, having conversations with people, and the examples are really endless of the ways that both foundations can sponsor their own work and their grantees into networking events and platforms for other donors, to the great benefit, financial and organizational development-wise, of their grantees. So one thing before I discuss our services I just want to end with here is a quote from Carl Robichaux, who I spoke with a couple of months ago, who's program officer with the International Peace and Security Program, the international program of Carnegie Corporation of New York. I used to do some work with him, and he said, I asked him, what would happen if more groups came to you and got educated about their potential to tap into donor alliances as issue briefers. And he said, well, what we could offer richer programming for grantmaker alliances if more groups came to us with good ideas for educating the donor community on their issues. This could help change the nature of our planning and help us make better use of our membership and leadership in grantmaker networks. So it was a wonderful testimonial to the power of the grant maker to actually enrich the dialogue that takes place in donor settings if they take this seriously. Once again, if they have the capacity to take this seriously. He also then went on to say, of course, that we'd have to learn how to say no more often if more groups came to us more frequently. Once again, because of their own capacity. And of course, that's the case as well. So what do we do here at Echo Communications, and how can this help you and your agenda? What we do is offer a series of tools and consulting services, coaching, and other kind of flash drives with applications for donor networks that you might not participate in yet, but that are relevant to your work. Flash drives with contact information for your communications directors of each of the communications directors of donor networks across the country, so that you can begin sending them regularly to your new and cutting-edge information, new grants information if you're not already doing that. Coaching and consulting work about, we'll take a look at your activities with respect to reaching out to grantmaker alliances, such as the ones that I've mentioned on this webinar. And we'll make recommendations for how you could make your presence in these networks even stronger. We'll go network by network by network through them with you to illustrate for you how each of them holds even greater potential than what you're up to. There's no doubt in my mind. Every conversation that I've ever had with anyone about donor networks, and where they're absolutely convinced that they're doing everything they could, there's always more. Sitting on boards, task forces, promoting grantees in all the ways, not just one or two of the ways that are possible, doing it consistently. We've been at this now for researching this for 2 years now, the case, just launching this service, and would be absolutely thrilled to work with you. My contact information, phone number is 202-375-0743, and email is mimi.ghez@echocommunications.net, which is on the screen for you right now. And I'm going to end with just a couple of testimonials. The first one is from one of my current clients. She's a grantee, many foundation supporters, and she says she's someone who I'm working with on sort of on childhood educational issues, looking at how children in the DC area can be educated about international affairs. And she says, Echo Communications' innovative approach is enabling our organization to gain access into grantor networks that exist in the areas of education and civic engagement. Echo President Mimi Ghez is helping our leaders and staff build the knowledge and skills to approach our supporters about gaining visibility within these networks. We are confident this approach will help us achieve long-term sustainability, says Paula Boland, Executive Director, United Nations Association of the National Capital Area. And another one from my years of interviewing leadership at donor networks and foundations across the country. This one from Bruce Trachtenberg, who is Executive Director of the Communications Network, one of only 41 affinity groups recognized by the Council on Foundations. And he calls hidden opportunities for grantors and their advisors, the project that I've just been describing to you, and our services, a fascinating undertaking. So at the very least, we hope that you've walked away learning something new to consider, something different that you can do to approach achieving your interests within donor network settings. And we look forward to hearing back from you, and we wish you the best of luck.